The cold December wind howled across the vast plains of Iowa, carrying with it the soft scent of frost and pine. Snow blanketed the landscape in a pristine sheet of white, interrupted only by the wooden fences that framed the fields and the humble farmhouse at the center of it all. The Miller farm had stood in the same spot for over 3 generations. Its current caretaker, Jacob Miller, a weathered man in his late 50s, had lived his entire life on this land. With his wife Sarah gone for nearly 10 years, the farm and its animals had become his entire world. To the neighbors, Jacob was a solitary figure, stoic and quiet, with a wiry frame and eyes that carried decades of both joy and hardship. This particular Christmas Eve had started like any other day for Jacob. The sun barely crept over the horizon when he donned his thick wool coat, pulled on his boots, and grabbed a bucket of feed to tend to the chickens. Though the farm had seen better days, Jacob took pride in his modest flock. He cared for them like family, giving each bird a name, speaking to them softly as he spread feed across the dirt ground of the coop. They clucked and pecked around his feet, their golden feathers gleaming under the rising sun. But something was off that morning. As Jacob approached the nesting boxes to collect the eggs, he stopped in his tracks. His calloused hand hovered midair, the bucket swaying at his side. The eggs weren't their usual speckled white or pale brown. No, what sat nestled in the straw were eggs unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. They were a deep, vivid red, almost crimson and smooth as glass. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He reached out tentatively, brushing his fingers over the surface of one. It was warm to the touch, just like any egg, but the color was unmistakable, bright and unnatural, like blood frozen in time. Jacob's heart quickened. He glanced around the coop at his chickens, who seemed unfazed, scratching the dirt as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "What in the world?" he muttered, lifting one of the eggs into the light. It glowed faintly, the color catching the rays of the sun. There were 12 of them in total, spread across the various nesting boxes. All the other eggs, normal ones, were absent, as if these crimson orbs had replaced them entirely. Shaking his head, Jacob carefully placed the strange eggs into his bucket. He wasn't one to believe in superstitions or old wives' tales, but something about these eggs unsettled him. He carried them back to the farmhouse, setting them gently on the kitchen counter. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating their rich hue. He sat there for a long while, staring at them, a knot forming in his chest. As the day went on, Jacob found himself unable to ignore the eggs. Thoughts of them gnawed at him while he shoveled snow from the driveway and repaired a loose plank on the barn. By evening, he had decided to let nature take its course. If they were eggs, they would hatch eventually, and perhaps then he'd have an answer. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that these eggs weren't ordinary, that they carried some kind of significance he couldn't yet comprehend. On Christmas morning, Jacob awoke to a peculiar sound, a soft rhythmic tapping coming from the kitchen. He threw on his robe and hurried down the stairs, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. As he entered the room, the sight before him stopped him dead in his tracks. The red eggs were shaking. Each one quivered and shifted, the tapping growing louder as tiny cracks began to spiderweb across their glossy shells. Jacob approached cautiously, his breath visible in the chilly air. He knelt by the counter, eyes wide, as the first egg began to split open. Piece by piece, the shell crumbled away, revealing what lay inside. A small, feathered creature emerged, its body covered in downy fluff. But it wasn't yellow or white like the chicks Jacob was used to seeing. No, this chick was a deep, fiery red, its tiny wings tipped with gold. It blinked up at Jacob with bright amber eyes, chirping softly. Before he could process what he was seeing, the other eggs began to hatch in unison. One by one, the crimson shells broke apart, revealing more of the unusual chicks. Each one was identical, red as embers, with golden-tipped wings and eyes that seemed to glimmer with an otherworldly light. Jacob's hands trembled as he reached out to gently scoop up one of the chicks. It fit perfectly in his palm, its tiny heartbeat fluttering against his skin. Tears filled his eyes, unbidden and unstoppable. For years he had spent Christmas alone, the ache of Sarah's absence a constant companion. But here in his hands was something extraordinary, something he couldn't explain but felt deeply grateful for. He held the chick close to his chest, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Merry Christmas, little one." In the days following Christmas, Jacob found himself dedicating all his time and energy to the care of the unusual chicks. The 12 red-feathered creatures had an undeniable beauty to them, a brilliance that seemed almost ethereal. Their tiny chirps filled the house with a warmth Jacob hadn't felt in years, their bright eyes following him as he moved about the kitchen or by the hearth. They clung to him like a flock of ducklings, waddling after him wherever he went, their tiny feet pattering across the wooden floor. But as the days passed, Jacob began to notice things that set them further apart from any animal he had ever raised. For one, they grew faster than normal chicks. By the end of the first week, they were nearly twice the size of a typical chick, their feathers deepening to a more vivid red, shimmering faintly in the sunlight like embers in a fire. Their wings, tipped with gold, grew stronger, and Jacob could see them practicing short, awkward jumps, as if they were eager to take flight. Their diet was peculiar as well. While regular chicks were content with feed, these creatures had an insatiable appetite for fresh fruit. Apples, berries, and even vegetables like carrots. They ignored the grain Jacob put out for them, chirping insistently until he brought them the fresh produce they seemed to crave. It wasn't easy for him to keep up with their demands, especially in the dead of winter when food was scarce. He began making trips into town more frequently, buying crates of fruit and vegetables from the local market. The townsfolk, curious about his sudden purchases, began to ask questions. "What's all this for, Jacob?" asked Marlene, the clerk at the general store. "Did you finally take up gardening?" Jacob hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "Something like that," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. He didn't want to share the truth. Not yet. He didn't fully understand it himself, and a part of him feared how others might react to something so strange. As January rolled in, the weather grew colder, and Jacob decided to move the growing birds to the barn. He spent an entire day preparing a section of it for them, lining the floor with fresh hay and setting up heat lamps to keep them warm. But the moment he tried to separate them from the house, chaos erupted. The birds squawked and flapped their wings, their cries piercing and frantic as they scrambled to stay close to Jacob. It was as if they couldn't bear to be apart from him. Relenting, he allowed them to stay inside for a little longer, despite the growing inconvenience. By mid-January, the chicks were the size of full-grown chickens, their feathers now shimmering with a brilliance that seemed almost alive. They began to test their wings more frequently, taking short, clumsy flights around the house. Jacob couldn't help but laugh as they crashed into furniture or landed awkwardly on the kitchen table, their golden wingtips leaving faint, glowing trails in the air. But then, strange things started happening. One night, as Jacob sat by the fire, reading an old book, he heard a soft, melodic sound. It was faint at first, like the hum of wind through the trees, but it grew steadily louder. He looked up, startled, and realized the sound was coming from the birds. They were perched on the back of the couch and along the windowsill, their beaks slightly open as they emitted a haunting, harmonious tune. The sound filled the room, resonating deep within Jacob's chest, stirring emotions he couldn't explain. Tears welled up in his eyes as the melody washed over him, a mixture of sorrow and hope, grief and joy. It was as if the birds were singing directly to his soul, unlocking emotions he had buried long ago. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly mourn Sarah, to feel the weight of her absence and the love he still carried for her. But it wasn't just Jacob who noticed the birds' peculiarities. One snowy morning, as Jacob let them outside to stretch their wings, his neighbor Earl happened to drive by. Earl was a gruff man, always quick with a judgment, and he slammed on his brakes when he saw the red-feathered creatures darting through the air. "What in tarnation is that, Jacob?" Earl demanded, stepping out of his truck. "Just some new birds I'm raising," Jacob replied, trying to sound casual. Earl squinted at the flock, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Those don't look like no chickens I've ever seen. Where'd they come from?" Jacob hesitated. "Found their eggs in the coop. Don't know much else." Earl didn't look convinced. He muttered something under his breath about strange happenings and drove off. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Earl's curiosity would lead to trouble. As the weeks went on, Jacob began to worry about how long he could keep the birds a secret. They were growing rapidly, and their strange behavior, like their glowing feathers and haunting songs, made them impossible to ignore. One night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a thought crept into his mind. What if these birds weren't meant to be here? What if they were some kind of sign or omen? His worries only deepened when one of the birds became ill. It was the smallest of the flock, a little one Jacob had nicknamed Ruby. She began to lag behind the others, her chirps weaker, her movements sluggish. Jacob did everything he could to nurse her back to health, but nothing seemed to work. Late one night, as he sat by Ruby's side stroking her soft feathers, he whispered, "I don't know what you are, but I'm not going to let you go. Not without a fight." He stayed up all night, tending to her, praying silently for her recovery. As dawn broke, Ruby's faint chirps grew stronger, and Jacob felt a glimmer of hope. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The birds were changing, and their presence on his farm was drawing attention. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. The days continued to stretch on as winter gripped the Miller farm, but Jacob couldn't ignore the undeniable changes in the red-feathered flock. By early February, the birds were no longer chickens in any recognizable sense. They had grown larger, easily the size of hawks, and their feathers had deepened to a radiant scarlet that seemed to shimmer like molten metal in the sunlight. Their golden wingtips now emitted a soft glow, especially at night, casting faint streaks of light across the walls when they flew around the house. Jacob had taken to letting them fly in the barn during the cold evenings, a makeshift aviary he'd prepared just for them. But even that wasn't enough. Their wings had become stronger and their instincts more restless, as if the barn wasn't vast enough for what they were becoming. They soared in high, graceful arcs, their golden-tipped wings nearly brushing the rafters, and Jacob began to notice something new, an unnatural heat radiating from their bodies, like a faint ember warming the cold winter air. Ruby, the smallest of the flock, had fully recovered under Jacob's care. In fact, she had grown more confident than ever, often leading the others in their synchronized flights. She seemed to have a special bond with Jacob, always fluttering to perch on his shoulder or rest in his arms. He began talking to her more, confessing his thoughts and fears in the solitude of the barn. "What are you all becoming?" he'd whisper to Ruby, stroking her gleaming feathers. "I've never seen anything like you. Are you some kind of miracle, or something I don't understand yet?" The birds' songs had also become more powerful, resonating through the farm like a symphony whenever they gathered together. Jacob would often find himself frozen in place, overcome by the harmonies. He couldn't explain it, but the melodies felt alive, as if they were pulling at something deep inside him. However, the world outside the farm was beginning to close in. Earl, the nosy neighbor, hadn't forgotten about the unusual sight he'd witnessed weeks earlier. One particularly bitter morning, as Jacob returned from the general store with crates of apples and carrots for the birds, Earl was waiting for him by the gate. "Jacob," Earl called out, his breath visible in the icy air, "we need to talk." Jacob tightened his grip on the crates. "Morning, Earl," he said cautiously, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. Earl's face was grim. "I've been talking to some folks in town. People are starting to wonder what you're hiding up here." "Chickens don't glow, Jacob, and they sure as hell don't look like what I saw flying around your yard." "They're just birds, Earl," Jacob said firmly, though his voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. Earl squinted at him, his arms crossed. "You sure about that? Because they don't look natural, and unnatural things don't tend to sit well with people around here." Jacob's jaw tightened. "It's none of your concern." "Maybe not," Earl replied, stepping closer. "But you know how this town is. If people think you're hiding something strange, they're gonna come snooping, and when they find it, it won't be good for you or those birds." Jacob stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. Earl wasn't threatening him outright, but his words carried an ominous weight. Jacob knew he had to protect the birds at all costs, but he also knew Earl was right. The more the birds grew and changed, the harder it would be to keep them a secret. That night, as the birds settled in the barn, Jacob sat in his armchair by the fire, deep in thought. He felt an ache in his chest, a mixture of fear and love. The birds had become his family, filling the void left by Sarah's passing and the years of loneliness that had followed. But now he felt that familiar fear creeping back, the fear of losing something precious. He glanced out the window at the barn, its roof faintly glowing from the golden light of the birds inside. "What are you trying to tell me?" he murmured, his voice trembling. The answer came sooner than he expected. A few nights later, just as the sun was setting, Jacob heard a commotion outside. He rushed to the window and saw Earl and 2 other men from town standing by the barn, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One of them was carrying a rifle. Jacob's heart plummeted. "No," he whispered, grabbing his coat and rushing outside. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice firm but shaking. Earl turned to him, his expression hard. "We've been hearing things, Jacob. Strange noises, lights in the night sky. People are saying you've got something dangerous in there." "They're just birds," Jacob shouted, stepping between the men and the barn. "Birds don't glow like fire," one of the men muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. "I won't let you hurt them," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "They haven't done anything to you." But before anyone could respond, a sound pierced the air, a high, melodic cry that seemed to shake the very ground. The men froze, their flashlights trembling in their hands. Jacob turned toward the barn, his breath catching in his throat. The doors burst open and the flock emerged. But they were no longer just birds. The creatures that soared out of the barn were majestic, their wings spanning nearly 6 feet, their feathers glowing like molten gold. Their bodies shimmered with an otherworldly brilliance, casting beams of light across the snowy ground. Ruby led the flock, her song resonating through the air, harmonizing with the others in a chorus that brought the men to their knees. The heat radiating from the birds melted the snow beneath them, and their glowing forms lit up the night sky like 1,000 lanterns. Jacob fell to the ground, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know what they were. Angels, spirits, something divine, but he knew they were special. Earl and the other men stared in awe, their weapons forgotten. The fear in their eyes was replaced with wonder as the flock circled above, their golden light illuminating the farm. Jacob whispered, "Go. Be free." As if understanding him, the flock ascended higher, their glowing forms disappearing into the night sky. Ruby was the last to leave, pausing to perch on Jacob's shoulder one final time. He stroked her feathers, his heart breaking. "Thank you," he whispered. With a final chirp, Ruby spread her wings and soared after the others, leaving Jacob alone in the snowy field, bathed in their fading light. The night after the flock disappeared was eerily quiet. The glowing light that had bathed the Miller farm was gone, leaving only the cold and the pale shimmer of moonlight on the snow. Jacob stood in the empty barn, staring at the scattered hay and the now useless heat lamps that had once warmed the extraordinary creatures. His chest felt hollow, as though a piece of himself had taken flight with them. The other men, including Earl, had long since retreated, their faces pale and shaken by what they had witnessed. They hadn't said a word to Jacob before leaving, only murmurs of disbelief as they clambered back into their trucks. Jacob could hear their tires crunching over the snow as they sped away, heading toward town with a story no one would believe. Jacob returned to the farmhouse, his body heavy with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. He sat by the dying embers in the fireplace, staring into the flickering orange glow and replaying the events in his mind. He thought of Ruby's tiny chirps when she was just a chick, the way she had perched on his shoulder and leaned into him like she trusted him completely. He thought of the flock's hauntingly beautiful songs, the strange heat they radiated, and the glowing trails their golden-tipped wings left in the air. And then he thought of the moment they had flown away, their transformation complete, their purpose fulfilled, though he still didn't fully understand what that purpose had been. "Why me?" Jacob whispered to the empty room. "Why here? Why now?" He wanted answers, but none came. All he was left with was the silence and the ache of their absence. In the days that followed, Jacob tried to return to his old routine. The normal chickens, who had stayed oddly silent during the weeks the red-feathered flock had lived in the barn, began laying eggs again. He fed them, collected the eggs, shoveled snow from the driveway, and made repairs to the barn. Life continued, but the spark that the birds had brought into his world was missing. The townsfolk, as expected, were buzzing with rumors about what had happened at the Miller farm. Earl and the others had been too spooked to describe the events in detail, but they'd told enough for the town to brand Jacob as the old man with the glowing birds. Some said it was a miracle. Others whispered that it was something unnatural, even dangerous. Jacob didn't care what they thought. He kept to himself, just as he always had. But the house felt emptier than ever, the silence more oppressive. It wasn't until the first signs of spring began to emerge that something changed. One morning, as Jacob was walking through the fields, he noticed patches of grass that seemed greener, more vibrant than the rest of the landscape. At first, he thought it was just the way the sunlight hit the ground. But as the days went on, the patches began to spread. Flowers that shouldn't have bloomed for another month began to sprout in the vibrant grass. Wildflowers in shades of red and gold, their petals shimmering faintly in the sunlight. Jacob knelt by one of the patches, his fingers brushing against the soft petals, and felt a warmth radiating from the flowers, just like the warmth the birds had emitted. It wasn't just the fields that were changing. The barren apple tree near the barn, which hadn't produced fruit in years, was suddenly covered in blossoms. The branches, once gnarled and lifeless, now teemed with life. By mid-April, the tree was heavy with apples, crisp, red, and larger than any Jacob had ever seen. He bit into one of the apples out of curiosity and felt tears spring to his eyes. It was the sweetest, juiciest fruit he'd ever tasted, the flavor so rich it seemed to fill him with energy. He brought baskets of the apples into town to sell, and soon word spread about the magic apples from the Miller farm. People came from neighboring towns to buy them, marveling at their size and taste. For the first time in years, Jacob's farm began to flourish. The vibrant grass and flowers attracted more animals, birds, deer, and even rabbits, who seemed drawn to the land. The chickens began laying more eggs than ever before, and the soil, once dry and hard, became fertile and easy to work. Jacob planted vegetables in the fields and watched as they grew faster and healthier than anything he'd ever cultivated. But it wasn't just the farm that changed. Jacob himself began to feel different. The years of loneliness and grief that had weighed him down seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He still missed the flock, especially Ruby, but he began to feel that their presence had been a gift, a moment of grace in the midst of his solitude. One morning, as he was tending to the apple tree, he noticed something glinting in the grass beneath it. He knelt down and found a single golden feather, its edges faintly glowing in the sunlight. Jacob held it in his hands, his heart swelling with emotion. "They were never really gone," he murmured, a tear slipping down his cheek. He brought the feather inside and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, where it caught the light and seemed to fill the room with a faint, golden glow. The years went by, and the Miller farm became known far and wide for its miraculous produce. People came from miles around to see the vibrant fields and taste the sweet apples, but Jacob never told anyone the full story. He kept the memory of the flock close to his heart, a secret he cherished like a sacred treasure. Every spring, the flowers in the fields would bloom in shades of red and gold, their glow faint but unmistakable. And every year, Jacob would find a single golden feather beneath the apple tree, a quiet reminder of the extraordinary creatures that had once graced his life. Though he never fully understood why they had come to him, Jacob felt certain of one thing: the birds had left him more than just memories. They had given him hope, purpose, and a chance to heal. As he sat by the fire one evening, staring at the golden feather on the mantel, Jacob smiled to himself. For the first time in years, he felt that Sarah was watching over him, her presence as warm and comforting as the glow of the feather. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling with gratitude. The farm, the flock, and the life they had left behind were all part of a story he would carry with him until the end of his days. A story of love, loss, and the miracles that could take flight when you least expected them. As the years passed, the Miller farm became a place of quiet wonder, a living testament to the miracle Jacob had experienced. Though he grew older and slower with time, Jacob found solace in the vibrant life that surrounded him. The fields remained lush, the apple tree bore fruit year after year, and the red and gold flowers returned each spring without fail. as if the birds had left a piece of their magic behind. The golden feather stayed on the mantle, its soft glow illuminating the farmhouse like a small, eternal flame. Visitors would often glance at it with curiosity, asking Jacob where it came from, but he would only smile, his weathered face crinkling with a quiet warmth. "Just a little piece of something special," he'd say, keeping the true story close to his heart. In his later years, Jacob often found himself standing beneath the apple tree, gazing up at its strong branches and listening to the wind as it rustled the leaves. On some days, when the sun hit the fields just right, he swore he could see flashes of red and gold darting through the sky, like distant embers carried by the breeze. He liked to think it was Ruby and the flock, visiting him in their own way, reminding him that he was never truly alone. When Jacob eventually passed away, the townsfolk gathered at the farm to pay their respects. Though few had ever known the full extent of the miracles that had taken place there, they all spoke of the man who had cared for his land with unshakable devotion, who had brought life and beauty to a once-forgotten farm. After his passing, the farm continued to thrive. No one could explain the vibrant fields, the glowing flowers, or the ever-bountiful apple tree, but they became a source of quiet inspiration for anyone who visited. The golden feather remained on the mantle, untouched and undimmed, a symbol of the extraordinary bond Jacob had shared with his flock. And every spring, when the red and gold flowers bloomed across the fields, the townsfolk would gather to marvel at their beauty, sharing whispered tales of the mysterious birds that had once graced the farm. To them, the Miller farm was more than just a patch of land. It was a reminder that even in the darkest winters, miracles could take root, and that love, no matter how fleeting, could leave behind a legacy that endured for generations.